Hello, and welcome back to the Point Left podcast with your hosts,
Skyler
and Kaylynne. Nice.
All right. So before we begin, audio listeners only, eat shit. So this is a treat for the video watchers. My shirt. Want to read off what it says?
It says, "I see you sinning, and I'm all for it. The law of God, get laid." And it has Jesus and crosses on it.
Yeah, I wore this to the airport, and I sat down, and I realized that when I'm sitting down, you can't really see the other half of it. So for a large chunk of the airport crowd, they just thought I was wearing a Jesus Sees You Sinning shirt, and I'm like, oh, God, they think I'm a freak. So we're just going to jump right on into it because I never know how to write a script that's less than like 9 pages long. So sorry. So before we dive right on in, because I feel like the internet has this discourse every like 3 months whenever like a new movie or a new TV show comes out and a whole new wave of tweens are forced to sit and watch something with their parents and then they get all hot and bothered and shamed. What is your opinion on sex scenes in movies and TV shows?
I feel like I kind of have a not conflicted opinion. My opinion is very much like it depends. I do feel like there are a lot of instances, specifically with like female nudity, where it's not necessary at all. And yet it's still added. I think there are a lot of sex scenes that aren't necessary at all, and they're still added. I'm also just very much a prude, like me, to bring it to a place of Vanderpump. Me and my roommate Taylor were watching Vanderpump last night, and there's a scene where I think it's like Sheena and Ariana. Not Ariana. I don't know. Two of the girls go to this like acting class. And their acting exercise, oh my God, no, it's Sheena and Lala. And their acting exercise is that they have to like have an orgasm. Like they have to pretend to have an orgasm. And so they're just like making sex noises.
When Harry Met Sally moment.
Literally. And I was just like, stop, please stop. I'm like, we don't need to see this. This adds nothing to the show. And I mean, that's like a reality TV show. But so I just like, it makes me uncomfortable. But I do think there are certain scenarios where like it has to add something and it has to mean something and it has to like be necessary to the plot or necessary to like say something about who that character is or whatever. Like it has to have a purpose. And then I'm like kind of fine with it. But also sometimes they go on way too long and I'm like, we get it. That's enough.
They're fucking.
Yeah. So yeah, it depends, is my opinion.
All right. So I'm going to take also kind of like a complicated, because it's a complicated issue. There's a reason that it keeps getting debated every couple of months, but I kind of want to get into the reason of why, because I'm really looking into it. And I'm going to throw a lot of articles at you. The articles attached to this episode is going to be like 8 articles, and all of them kind of say the same thing, which is like we keep having these debates, and yet the actual like things that are coming out are not all that sexy. Like I think the first article I'm going to read, the I guess not title, that's not what it's called. Headline, I guess. Movies today are largely sexless, so where is the sex scene discourse coming from? In like the smaller like little byline font. These sex scenes you mentioned, are they in the room with us? They opened with this quote that a media critic said recently, which is, "Everyone is beautiful and no one is horny." So in a nutshell, this article discusses how most action films and blockbusters nowadays show actors and actresses at the peak of their physical form. They dedicate these long shots to their toned bodies, but they avoid depictions of sex and sexual expression in general. And in order to make movies more appealing to a wide audience, including parents and children, studios have been making them as chaste as they possibly can. Most theatrical releases nowadays are PG-13 with hardly any mentions of sex, and yet the debate about the prevalence of sex scenes has been more heated than ever, and the debate gained new traction. Remember when Penn Badgley, the star of You, said that he was against appearing in sex scenes out of respect for his wife? Of course, Badgley as a professional is entitled to decide which kinds of scenes he is comfortable participating in, but his decision to give up on fictional sex led to this huge debate online about the necessity of sex scenes in TV and movies that had some viewers essentially asking for the Hays Code to come back. And this isn't the first time that sex scenes have come under fire. However, in an era of, TV and movies where sex has become kind of so rare for us to see, it kind of begs the question of where this debate is even really coming from. And it doesn't really take long for anyone to notice that the more vocal proponents of the subject usually belong to a younger demographic. This isn't necessarily a surprise. I didn't know this. According to research done in 2022, teenagers all around the globe are having less sex than their counterparts from previous generations. Data collected from kids ranging from 14 to 19 years old show that the number of adolescents that claim to engage in no kind of sexual activity, including masturbation, rose from 28.8% to 44.2% amongst boys and 49.5% to 74% amongst girls between the years of 2009 and 2018.
Wow.
Yeah. This data not only shows that interest in sex is declining amongst kids, but also points to a disconnect between teenagers and young adults' actual sex lives and how it is portrayed in the media. Though movies these days have become largely sexless in order to appeal to a wider audience, like we said, television seems to be doubling down on sex scenes, particularly amongst teenage characters. The rise of cable and subsequently streaming services ushered in a new era for TV in which executives and showrunners could let go of limitations such as parental ratings and reach wider demographics. Audience clustering means that shows can now be produced with more and more specific kinds of viewers in mind, and this in turn means that there is more room for experimentation and risk-taking. And among those risks are the more realistic and even graphic depictions of sex.
The Idol. That
most HBO.
Yeah, that immediately came to mind. I was like, that was a show that
was torture porn, more than just softcore porn.
I was like, that did not need the sex scenes, and the sex scenes was like half of it.
Sam Levinson, Meet Me Outside.
Yeah, it was. Oh my god, it was atrocious. Anyway.
No, good. Most of the people's when everyone kind of brings up this question of like, what's a sex scene that you think is, largely unnecessary, or what sex scenes ruined it? A lot of people talk about like HBO's programming, which they kind of have made their brand in like, this ain't your mama's TV, and they've done that. Oh my fucking god, I just had a stroke on camera. They've kind of had that branding of themselves for like the past decade of like, their sex scenes they're not your mom. There's no just sheet covering up movement down here. You're gonna see cock and balls. So this increase in like the graphic sex scenes isn't necessarily a problem, but it does cause some discomfort when we look at shows aimed at younger audiences that have teenage characters as protagonists. Think Netflix's Elite or HBO's Euphoria, for instance. Though they're having less and less sex, teenagers see themselves on television engaging in frequent and risky sexual behavior, sometimes even with adults. And they fail to identify with what's being shown to them on TV. And being online, kids these days have more access to information surrounding media consumption and how it impacts society. Namely, they've become more aware that the sexualization of fictionalized teens contributes to their own sexualization by adults in the real world. And the article goes on to say that the discourse around sex in media could have stemmed from all the eroticized and excessive portrayals of sexual violence over the years. That conversation really hit its peak when Game of Thrones was on the air. Now, if you include a rape scene in your media, you get flamed. And honestly, I'm glad for that. I cannot think of a single reason why rape scenes are a thing. But that starting point fostered a very weak stomach for all sex scenes in general. And the article goes on to theorize that the debate could be because sex scenes are becoming so rare that when they do happen, it seems like a much larger deal. And the fact that so many stories can tell love stories without sex at all has kind of sold people on this idea that sex scenes themselves are unnecessary. This last year, The Bear was called one of the year's horniest programs, despite featuring not an ounce of sex at all. Netflix's Bridgerton, season 1 had 15 sex scenes, and that made it like a global phenomenon. But after hearing, they said, audience feedback, their next season only had 2, and those were towards the end of the whole season. You had to wait for a whole season of build-up. In my personal opinion, I like that better, just because I do like some good build-up before you hit the snap of they are fucking on my screen.
No, absolutely.
But that's just my, opinion. And an article from Lithium magazine is that erotic thrillers just don't exist anymore, and even romance films are kind of hard to come by in theaters. You can find plenty of them as streaming originals, but as far as going out to theaters, romance movies aren't really a thing. Not as if they not as much as they were in the 90s and early 2000s. Instead, screens are monopolized by action and superhero movies, and this makes sense because cinemas are dominated by children and teens more than they ever have been before. And in a piece for The Guardian, Edward Helmore quips, include sex and you'll get an R rating, and that means no kids, and that's not going to bring in a 4-quadrant audience. In another Vogue article called Why Are Sex Scenes Still So Controversial? The online resistance to sex scenes in movies and TV isn't coming out of nowhere. Again, young people are having less sex than ever before, a trend that is often painted as societal scourge, but it might just simply reflect the fact that those same young people are feeling less pressured. It's been 55 years since the end of the Hays Code, which set industry guidelines for what kind of sex and violence could be seen on screen. And we aren't suffering a shortage of boobs or violence, but we are lacking in the amount of sex scenes and what they could represent. Like, despite the popularity of recent queer films like Red, White, and Royal Blue and Bottoms, both of which have the same actor, which is funny, straight cisgender people are still most likely to be featured in mainstream sex scenes, leading to an underrepresentation of sex that is more familiar to LGBTQ viewers, or even like older people. You can see old people have sex. Old people, we kind of mentioned this in our aging podcast episode, where like if old women are like sexual, it's either like horrific, a nightmare, or like a joke in like an Adam Sandler movie. It's like, haha, she's sucking dick with no teeth.
Yeah. Interesting. I will say I saw the Hays Code written out on your script, and this is the first time I think I've actually read it. I thought it was like haze. Like Haze. It's Hays. So feeling very educated this evening.
So I feel like we can't have this conversation about young people and sex in the media without talking about Heartstopper. And listen.
Like, there's a reason.
This is actually relevant. Okay, this is not just me being obsessed with it again. So for the few of you who haven't seen Heartstopper yet, leave a comment down below so I can find you and force you to watch it Clockwork Orange style. But until then, it is a tween/teen romance coming-of-age television show based on a series of graphic novels. And one of the main selling points of Heartstopper is that it celebrates taking your time with your sexuality, be that your own sexual identity or taking your time doing sexual things with your partner. It celebrates moments of intimacy that aren't just sex or sexual acts. And it was first seen as this like refreshing take on high schoolers that feels more close to life than other shows that take place in high school, even on the same streaming platform. So it's on Netflix. Like Sex Education is on Netflix. I'm blanking on other things right now, but like Netflix is no stranger to showing some sex scenes. Mm-hmm. Me personally, I wasn't having sex in high school, and only like a handful of my friends were. Mostly we were worried about like other stuff like college and grades and trying like really hard not to be depressed. So our Heartstopper in that way felt more realistic than other media aimed at teens. It kind of felt more real. But Heartstopper has run into a problem, and that problem was exacerbated by the release of the second season that dropped this past August. So fans of the show are doing that thing that all fans do once their show reaches like a certain level of popularity, and that's that they are not being normal. So they're putting it on this like pure pedestal, and they're idolizing it amongst other teen media, and notably among other queer media. To quote Twitter user Foz Meadows, when you talk about how icky and gross and problematic that other queer content is with the fucking and the swears and the moral ambiguity and the bad choices, they're not good and clean and pure, all you're really doing is siding with the same leopards who will later eat your face. Mm-hmm. Referencing that meme, it's like, when I voted for the leopards that would eat your face party, I never thought they'd eat my face. Like homophobes, racists, etc. Let me make this clear. Heartstopper is not good just because there's no sex in it. Including sex in Heartstopper will not ruin it. Currently, new chapters of Heartstopper are being released twice a month on Webtoon, and in these most recent chapters, sex is finally discussed, with main characters Nick and Charlie exploring and developing that area of their relationship. And the novella titled Nick and Charlie also includes a very like cut to the curtains sex scene and a mention that they have had sex in the past. And according to what I've seen on Twitter and TikTok, which you'd think wouldn't be a lot, but I'm dialed in too much. I think I've seen every single take about this show that can possibly be posted on the fucking internet. This is either A, a very unpopular choice, or B, people are just like freaking out about it like it's the most scandalous thing ever, both of which worry me. Like, I get it. It can be a little disheartening to see what you consider another piece of teen media falling into the sex pit. But that itself is kind of telling of another serious problem with infantilizing and woobifying gay people, notably gay men. It's like there's this scandalous outcry when these two like precious innocent little gay babies dare to be horny. Mm-hmm. This is not a requirement for a relationship by any means, but these two characters specifically are in a long-term, serious relationship. They love each other, they are sexually attracted to each other, they want to have sex, and thus they have sex. And the amount of pearl clutching and fainting about that just rubs me the wrong way. Some critics have called Heartstopper puritanical with its heavily censored content, and I don't fully agree with that. I think calling it puritanical implies that it's this PG for cynical or even ignorant reasons, and I don't think that's the case. I think the creator just really wanted to showcase that queer media doesn't always have to be not only dark and depressing, but that coming out as gay isn't inherently a sexual proclamation. It's like all those conservatives that are like, how can you come out as gay at 11? He's too young to be having gay sex. Like, sir, those are different. Sir, sex and sexuality are two very different conversations, and I'm glad that Heartstopper is doing the work at separating them. However, this is coming with the added consequence that their fan base is becoming puritanical with how they interact with it. Like, Nick and Charlie have a 4-minute makeout montage in the second season of the show, and you would have thought these two were just fucking butt-fuck naked by how the internet was reacting to them. And with the broader acceptance of queer spaces into the mainstream, there needs to be a bigger push on insisting that gay people are also normal. Like, they aren't these, two pure angels who blush like nuns when they chastely hold hands. They can be, absolutely. I'm not saying that being gay is one experience. But to be, angry or frenzied at the idea that these gay teens can also have sex just like their straight counterparts, that's not being helpful. It's I noticed with the, Heartstopper getting bigger and bigger with more and more fans, it's this wave of 13-year-olds who are oh, finally I can watch gay people without that horrible, disgusting gay intimacy. Finally I can watch one. I'm like, fuck you. This is not for you. Get out of my sight. Over the weekend, I saw the movie Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is also a piece of media depicting a queer teen love story. The movie's mid. That's not the point. And I wish it wasn't mid, but it is. The two boys only kiss twice, but they write letters back and forth. And in one such letter, one character asks the other if he masturbates. At the mere mention of masturbation, there was an audible groan across my whole theater with two people sitting on both sides of me. One of them going out loud, no, no, no. One of them was oh God, I gotta get out of here. And these are not kids. These are grown people. I'm I see you. You have wrinkles. You have gray hair. We can handle it. At the mention of masturbation, they didn't even do anything. They didn't show anything. They didn't imply that he was jerking it under the sheets or anything. They just mentioned it, and this blanket of squeamishness just erupted in my theater. Surprise! Sometimes gay people masturbate. There is a song, it's Jesus Christ 2005, God Bless America, which is a collab between the 1975 and Phoebe Bridgers. And I saw a TikTok recently with several thousand likes saying Phoebe's verse is so beautiful until Maddie Healy wrote the next lyric, because the full line is, I'm in love with the girl next door. Her name's Claire. Nice when she comes around to call, then masturbate the second she's not there. And so many comments on that TikTok being I like to cut it off right before the end, before the man with the lyrics ruin. Can we not just call that homophobia? That you can tolerate this pretty flowy lyric about being in love with the girl next door, but the second it talks about sexual pleasure, it's filthy and disgusting. And surely only the horny man could have come up with it instead of a woman who must have been strong-armed into singing about masturbating, because that's fucking nasty. At what point do we just kind of peel back that might not be good either? This is making me sound like I'm super comfortable with sex scenes and sex mentions in all of my media all the time. And I'll be honest, I'm not. I really am not. But I'm also not that one woman who went viral, I don't know if you saw this, for having her husband shield his eyes when the sex scene in Oppenheimer was on.
I did not see that.
It went viral, I think, on TikTok and in Twitter. She's more of the religious wives, but she was basically she's she had her husband shield his eyes and hide his face into her shoulder whenever there was a sex scene in the theater. Yeah.
Are we children?
Yeah. Or she insisted that this movie have a trigger warning, not that sexual scenes, which is what the fucking rating system is, sexual scenes involved. It's not just that, but a warning for when sexual scenes are about to be shown, so that way they can take the necessary precautions. For instance, just walking out of the fucking theater and walking back in when the sex scene is over. Listen, guys, I'll just be uncomfortable in my seat.
Yeah.
Just sitting in your chair, kind of cringing a little bit. You'll survive. But here's the thing, just because I'm not comfortable with something doesn't mean that it's automatically bad, which I think is a real issue that I think Gen Z and millennials actually struggle to comprehend. Just because it makes you personally uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's automatically evil and should be banned. Me, I get it. I don't love when I see kink at Pride, even as a teen. I was oh, what the fuck is that? Do you know what I do? I look the other fucking way because I realize it isn't for me. But if I start like moral policing what is and isn't acceptable at fucking Pride, what does that solve? What does that prove? That I'm better than them? I'm not. In fact, I guarantee you that people who shamelessly display their kinks at Pride are braver than me. They are braver than you. They are braver than any U.S. Marine. That takes genuine courage. Just like, yep, yiff away, good friend, in full leather.
I feel like a lot of people tend to forget that art is often made to like be a piece of life, you know, to like depict real life. And especially when it comes to relationships, like sex is a huge part of that in most cases. So I guess I don't really understand like the whole wanting to remove it completely. I will say when I was in college, I took a class one time. I can't remember what fucking class it was, but basically we were supposed to come up with like a new idea or like a solution to like triggering things in media, and basically we were supposed to like argue to the class whether we think like triggering things in media should just be completely removed or if there's a solution to it. And the solution that my group came up with was to, on streaming services like Netflix or something, you know how when you're watching a TV show it'll be like, oh, skip the, you know, intro of this and you can just like get onto the show, was to have something like that pop up when triggering things were to come on screen. That way you could choose whether or not you want to watch it or not. And like that would be in instances of like drug abuse, rape, incest, things like that. Like not necessarily consenting
or things you just personally don't want to see.
Yeah, which I guess in some cases like that could be triggering to people. I don't want to, you know, say like what is and isn't. But it is a little like if you're going to a theater, also this is my biggest fucking pet peeve. When you are in a theater, you are silent.
Yeah,
you are silent.
That quote from The Last of Us? It's like, we're not just quiet, silent.
Literally. There have been plenty of times in a movie where I'm like, oh, but I don't say anything aloud. I might like cover my face with my hands or something, but to be like no when like a sex scene comes on screen or someone talks about masturbating, like, I'm sorry, grow up. Literally, like, grow the fuck up. This is maybe like, stop being a snowflake. But like, I think it's a little ridiculous to assume that all of the media that is going to be made in alignment with like what you want.
Yeah.
And without keeping in mind that like these creators are creating things from their perspective and they are creating things in a way that speaks to them and that is, you know, maybe of their own experience. And like sex is a huge part of life. And I feel like to say that it's not and to like gloss over it in media could be inherently dangerous to even like our own perceptions of sex. You know, I feel like so many people talk about how important sex education is, and like obviously it's very, very important, but I also think part of that is like not villainizing it in this way where like it can't even be represented in a meaningful way on like TV or in film.
No, because I think someone, and it's going to get touched upon, like, super briefly later on, but, like, someone noticed that there is a very disheartening trend amongst the younger and younger generations where, on the one hand, they seem to be the most open-minded about things like, you know, if you're gay, if you're queer, if you're trans, if you have, like, mental illness, they on the surface, they're, like, very pro that. They're not going to kick you out. But on the other hand, they seem to have, like, as their world becomes... boomering myself, but as their world becomes more and more algorithmically inclined to just them, they find themselves incapable of actually being uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is something that genuinely, like, a lot of people are theorizing that, like, the younger and younger generations simply can't handle. Not that the older ones can handle it any better, but at least they have more experience with being uncomfortable. And, like, how a lot of people are like, I you know, support everyone with mental illness. But then sometimes mental illness isn't just, like, staying in bed all day. It's being a bitch. It's being it's throwing a fit. It's throwing shit. It's being self-destructive. It's being nasty. It's not bathing. It's not brushing your teeth. It's being unsavory. It's being a bitch and being mean and abusive. That is also mental illness. And I feel like a lot of people were like, no, I support it, but like as long as it doesn't inconvenience me in any way, as long as it doesn't make me personally uncomfortable. And sex does make you uncomfortable if you're not into it, you know, if you weren't prepared for it. I feel like that's a lot of why a lot of people feel so put off by sex scenes, is that as sometimes if you don't go into it knowing that's where it's gonna go, then it can be like a Band-Aid ripoff. Like I remember as a kid, there was nothing I hated more than like I would watch like a raunchy comedy, and the joke would be that the main character would lock eyes with a girl, cut to next scene, she's on top of him, like, because that's all it would take. Meanwhile, like I was just begging for any sort of gay media, because like these two girls are the closest of friends, and they understand each other like no other, and that's never gonna happen. But all it takes is like the girl and the guy to make eye contact once, and suddenly like cut to jump cut, they are fucking, like, or like they just both like flop back at the pillow at the same time. They're like, that was the best sex I've ever had. And I'm like, oh, okay. I think a lot of it is like you go into like a, you know, if you're turning on 50 Shades of Grey, you're like, I know what I'm getting into. You feel less uncomfortable that way because it's well advertised, and like when they have sex, it's a build up. Like, you know, the dress will slowly lift up the thigh, and you're like, yep, I know where this is going. Where a lot of times the editing could also make it seem like a jump scare. You're like, oh God, they're naked, and like it makes you want to like shield your eyes. And the earlier article in Vogue also talked about that maybe one of the reasons that, in addition to like, you know, like, oh, you know, rape scenes are bad, which they are. That's why I hate Outlander so much. Sorry, Mom, it sucks. Is that they just don't want to see like actors be uncomfortable. That like, you know, some actors will come out and they're like, there was an intimacy coordinator on set, you know, I was uncomfortable with the sex scene being in here. I was forced to do it against, you know, I wasn't comfortable with this. And it, you know, it seems like some people are like, oh no, like my favorite actor's in a sex scene, I hope they're not uncomfortable, like, because I would never want to do that. And I'm like, but they're actors. The circumstances are a little different. Just because you wouldn't doesn't mean that that's not something that they are comfortable doing. But again, like, you know, directors can sometimes twist their arm to do that. So that could also be a concern.
Yeah, that part's complicated. I will say, I think recently, especially with like all of the discourse that has been going on with like sex scenes in media and like sex scenes on set, it is pretty standard to have a sex coordinator. I don't think it is a requirement yet. But it's kind of like,
it raises eyebrows when you don't have it.
Yeah, if you don't. Exactly. So I definitely think, obviously, like historically in the past, there probably unfortunately have been a lot of sex scenes, and frankly probably still are, that actors are uncomfortable doing, that they feel violated in, that like, and that is never okay. Like that's never good. But I think all of these discussions are important in having, so that like when sex scenes are in media and when they are being, you know, performed on set, like you are having the proper precautions and like people in place to ensure that it is a safe and comfortable like situation to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this all kind of like brings us back to the main question: why are people, me included, so squeamish about sex scenes in movies and TV? And like, again, like maybe it could have something to do with not wanting the actors to be put in precarious circumstances, or it could be the phenomenon where just because something is scarce, it seems more intense since there's less to cushion the blow. But I think personally, kind of chewing on it a little bit, it could be for a couple other reasons. Okay, this is gonna be one of those moments where I connect red yarn on a corkboard with my points here, but bear with me. The housing market. Bear with me. Bear with me. So, more and more people are unable to live on their own, either having to live with roommates or to live with their parents. This could either be like their current situation or a living situation that they've lived in for longer than average, or at least longer than people in the past have had to live with their parents or live with other people. And we all know that one of the worst things on God's green earth is watching a spicy scene with your parents in the room. Oh God, it's the fucking worst. I get hot. I start talking through it. I like get nauseous. I just start like, oh, what's this? Hey everyone, I disapprove. And I'm like trying to desperately make eye contact with my dad. And I'm just like, I didn't put this on. I didn't know. I didn't. My mom was looking at me accusatory like I fucking made it.
I just sit so still. I do not move a muscle. I want my parents to forget that I'm even in the room.
You're like slowly, like you're cutting off your oxygen intake. Because you're like, I don't want to disturb them.
I know, I'm like.
It's giving like a fucking Squid Game hide and seek game where like it's a close up of your sweaty face. You're like, Like biting down on your fucking hand to make no noise.
There is no experience worse.
And like I think that knee-jerk reaction of shame, of embarrassment, has stuck around longer with us for some reason. And maybe it is that prolonged interaction with our families and friends, our lack of privacy in our living spaces, that make us more self-conscious about what it is that we're watching. We could be developing a pattern of that for later in life, of being put in situations where we had to answer for something we were watching. Someone walking there like, the fuck is this? Like those memes where it's like the anime, but when you're the anime when your mom walks in and it's like nothing but like tits and ass and she's like softcore moaning and your mom's like, what's this? Where'd you find this? Who made this? Who put this on? You're grounded. Like, we always, and I'll be honest, sometimes I'll watch, like, a cheesy show, and sometimes, like, my roommate Hannah will walk in, and she'll, like, she'll be scrolling on her phone, but suddenly I'm, like, very aware of how, like, dorky and bad what I'm watching is, and I get embarrassed, even though I didn't make it. I had this isn't my fault, but I'm just like, oh, no, she's gonna, like, judge me. And those patterns of like that reaction to being judged for what we're watching aren't going away as fast as they have in the past. Another thing too, that lack of privacy, I'm used to this feeling. I call it Catholic guilt. Or if I watched like a salacious or a spicy thing, I felt this giant wave of shame because God is looking right at me as I look at this filth. I will be alone watching a movie, but the second it turns into like a sex scene, I feel the need to posture that like I don't approve. I'll say out loud, I'm like, oh, what's this? Like, I'll need to look away. Who am I performing to? I'm alone. That's God, baby. You are being watched and you are being bad. Shame, shame, shame. I'm not even religious. That shit, like Catholic guilt has a
it's generational.
Nasty little habit of just being permanent ink on my brain. And so another little tinfoil hat moment. But at this point, we all kind of have to acknowledge that we do live in a surveillance state. Privacy is kind of a foreign concept. And if it isn't God watching you watch a sex scene, it's Siri. It's your smartphone. That feeling is exacerbated tenfold when you see a sex scene in a theater. Because that's dozens of people sharing your space as you all watch people pretend to have sex. It can feel humiliating. Like it's real. It's not. Your brain knows it's fake and that these are actors and you're not doing anything wrong. But it taps into this feeling of voyeurism that you are committing a sex crime. You are the creep in the closet watching people have sex. You are the one filming them with a fucking janky camcorder, you sick fuck. You're not! But it's just like this wash of like humiliation and shame just like washes over and I'm like, that's not you. You're watching a movie. This is normal. Get a grip. But like, why am I losing the grip?
Where has the grip gone?
And I think also the accessibility of porn kind of leads to this extremism when it comes to simulated sex scenes. Footage of actual sex happening is stupid easy to find. And so we, as the generations who grew up on the internet, we've had to navigate kink and weird sexual fantasy stuff more intensely than previous generations did. You can get yourself not that porn didn't exist before the internet, not what I'm saying. But like, you would have to kind of seek out to find it. You had to rent that shit. You had to go into a store and buy that shit. You had to find that shit. You had to pay-per-view that shit in the hotel room. You had to buy a Playboy magazine. 20 seconds on my smartphone, I can pull up a porn video right now for free. It doesn't take anything. And what could be perceived as like an innocent, like what you like, media shows up on your phone. It seems innocent on the surface. Having grown up with DeviantArt, that someone is jerking off to this. This is a fetish for someone, and certain like content will show up on like your TikTok or Instagram, your For You page, and it just has this like uncomfortable aura around it that you can pick up on that a lot of older people can't. They're like, that was random, and you're like, Mom, that was a fetish. They're smashing like milk with their feet. Oh, that is a fetish. Yeah. I know you don't know that. You just think it's random and like a waste of thing. And it is. But also they are directly pandering to a very weird fetish. And we have like fetish pickup on like antennae that I think older people just simply don't have, because they're like, if it's a fetish, they'll show up to me in leather in a full ball gag and then I'll know it's sexy. And you're like, the internet's weird. Mm-hmm. Okay, sometimes they hide this shit. And it doesn't help that, like, sex scenes nowadays are filmed way more intensely than sex scenes in the past. Like, where before, again, they might have been hidden by a sheet, or, like, the expressions could have been a little campier. A lot of, like, you might see some titties, but you're not going to see, like, cock and balls. You're not going to see, like, bare ass. Maybe you will, but not two bare asses. Not the girl's bare ass. But now with like HD camera angles and, the inclusion of intimacy coordinators and developments in like smaller genital protective wear, sex scenes look more real than they did before. It looks like they're fucking. They aren't. Legally, they can't be. but you know that, like, the cock sock that they have him wear is now smaller, and, like, everything's covered, essentially. You're not seeing his taint, because he got a fucking, you know, essentially a pad glued up there. You're not seeing his hole, but they're gyrating in a very realistic, very coordinated way that makes it look like sex. And all of that could make our brains way more sensitive to arousing things, and with that comes more shame. And again, to quote, like, the earlier article from the Sydney Morning Herald, a broader conversation is taking place in the TV landscape. Have we become so oversexed that we're now oversex?
Wow, what a nice play on words.
Because, like, outside of your Euphorias and, like, you know, you're the Idols and other HBO softcore porn escapades, sex scenes are actually allowed to be more realistic and more awkward and more messy. Like, this is going to be a little bit of me advocating for sex scenes now. Look at me. Who is he? He. I don't want to talk about that. Because, like, look at where we started with sex scenes. Who was having the sex, right? Beautiful, straight, cis, white people having hetero sex with each other. And if you did include sex with, like, a teen demographic in mind, it would be seen as this, like, taboo, avoidable thing that ruins lives. Like, Degrassi would be like, if you have sex, you will get STDs, you will get pregnant, assaulted, and die. And, like, Boy Meets World and other, like, you know, family-friendly, ABC-approved content, it would be, like, waiting for marriage. Abstinence is cool, kids. And then, like, Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the... For being a... Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City, for being a sex columnist, you are such a fucking prude about kink and sex and thinking that bisexuality is fake. And, like, God forbid you were gay on screen in the past 20 years and you wanted to have an intimate scene with someone. It was 90% like, well, congrats, you got AIDS. Hope that was worth it. Or, oop, you've been caught. Hope you like getting beaten to death. Like, sex scenes now can just do wonders for being like, hey, casual teen. Sex isn't necessarily something that you need to be doing, but you aren't going to immediately get pregnant and die. But it probably also won't be the greatest thing ever that will rock your world and make you complete. I think the more that sex scenes can get, like, accepted, the more that we can, like, really show bad sex scenes. I feel like in a lot of coming of age stories where, like, they can't get their shoes off in time and they're like, I didn't watch this, but I saw this clip from No Hard Feelings where he's like, did you come? She's like, that was my thighs. And he goes, oh. Like small, awkward, messy things that you can show that sometimes sex isn't always this, like, big, glorious thing. Because that was a problem. Like, I did fan fiction too young, and sex was always this perfect, mind-blowing thing that fucking always worked. Everyone always came all the time. Then every time they went blind for a second because the orgasmic rush of...
They heard angels in their ears.
And it's like... And then you have sex when, like, for the first time and you're like, so that hurt. Yeah. Owie, ow, 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 owie.
Well, and then I feel like that almost brings shame as well, because then you're like, well, I'm doing it wrong. Like, I'm doing something wrong. Like, it's my fault.
Because all the other sex scenes, everyone's always, like, flopping against the fucking pillow with bedhead being like, wow, that's the best I've ever had. Yeah, I feel like we've had enough of, like, the campy, cringy sex scenes of movies past that I feel like... But, like, that's why I think it's not good to get rid of them completely. And also, like, they can also, like, you know, gay sex can be just as intimate and normal as any other sex that you've seen. I personally have yet to see a lesbian sex scene that felt like it was made for lesbians. Every, like... You know, even like two girls making out, it always kind of feels like you're making it for the men and, like, the straight girls in the audience, and never for, like, actually sapphic women who, like, it's not made for us. And it's almost like it's always titillating for other people's arousal and not for ours. So I would like to see that potentially. Like, I get sex scenes can be awkward to sit through because sex can be awkward, especially if you're also not horny watching it, because that could also be the main difference, right? If you go around looking for sexual content when you are in the mood, it's gonna hit, versus if you're just down to watch a casual movie and you're suddenly thrust in this very intimate, very, like, embarrassing potentially situation that you were not prepped for. It can feel like an affront. It can feel like an offense. You're like, oh my god, I'm a hardworking American. I just came here to eat popcorn and watch some things. You're telling me now I get to see butts moving against other butts? Yeah. getting rid of them completely, I think also completely is a very puritanical, very ignorant way of looking at the world. And I don't want to be like, if you don't include sex, that's not the real world, because I think I made it very, not everything is sex, but I think also this idea that if you include sex, it's automatically this like debauched, filthy porn. I was like, that to me shows that you are putting way too much stock in sexual escapades that aren't immediately for your pleasure. Mm-hmm. Like, not every sex scene is meant to turn you on. Not every sex scene is meant for you to, like, if you can't handle a sexual situation because you automatically like, oh fuck no, I gotta go jack off, that to me gives a little more of like a porn addiction and less of like an actual need for the media around you to acclimate to your own needs and personal sensibilities. And allowing those tender moments of intimacy, they can allow people to like find themselves within cinema, and they can result in sexual awakenings and acceptance. I joke around a lot that like Rocky Horror Picture Show like gave little Skyler like 10 sexual awakenings, and I rewatched it as an adult. It gave me 10 more. But I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, you could have fried an egg on my face. I was beat red because my mom let me watch it, and for a lot of it, like, my head was buried in like the crook of her shoulder, and her hand was covering all of my eyes for most of it. The first time I watched Rocky Horror, the whole way through, I remember none of it, just because every 2 seconds my eyes were covered, and like with that ironclad mom grip that like her fucking fingers were fused to my scalp. So even if I wanted to like peer through, it's not happening. But I watched it eventually, and I was like, I'm discovering some things. And to quote that Vogue article again, depicting sex is not inherently negative, nor is it damaging to the viewer or to the actors engaged in the scene. Of course, sometimes those scenes have caused harm, like the lead actresses in that film Blue is the Warmest Color have come out saying that like, hey, that whole situation was not good, and a lot of regrettable things happened in that set. But that seems more like an argument for having intimacy coordinators on set rather than for shunning sex scenes altogether. Like you said, sex is a part of life, one that isn't inherently more problematic or dangerous to portray than any other facet of existence. And if we stand to lose something by it, if we try to disincline filmmakers from engaging with it, full stop. Because there's a new fear of like, you go to see like a hot new movie, and if it has sex in it, you're like, oh god, I wonder if the youths will take this away. Not to be like a full, conspiracy theory, but like, this is why we hate the younger generation, because I refuse to go that sour this fast. We can't turn on each other this fast. But yeah, it is, and not to bring it all the way back, but like, Gen Z, you're supposed to be the cool ones. Like, why are you guys being so conservative with this one area when it comes to things like sex? And I, on the one hand, am kind of proud of this conversation, because I do appreciate that we seem to be devaluing sex as this, like, it's not real love without it. Or, if the movie is incomplete without, because sex sells, I'm glad that we're trying to move away from that as like the epicenter of good cinema, of good storytelling, because you're right, not every situation needs it. But to insinuate that all sex scenes are unnecessary that's ignorant. You have not seen enough movies if that is the case. And I think too is, I don't know, I feel like we mentioned this meme a lot. You're like, I'm just a 26-year-old teenage girl. But I see tweets sometimes, like I saw a tweet the other day where it was like, I'm so tired of reading about teenage protagonists. And someone's like, girl, get the fuck out of the YA section. Which is true. I refuse to not watch kids' cartoons for a fat minute, because I was like, I don't want to see anything like uncomfortable. I'd rather watch like my kids show stuff. But then after a while I was like, oh, this is a kids show. Like, kids shows got a kids show eventually. There's only so much cool lore and cool art that you can tolerate at a kids show without them also having to teach you the value of friendship and other lame things that kids need. You don't. And, I feel like a lot of, toxic, cartoon fans, it's because they stem from this idea that like they want the media that they consume to adhere to their own personal sensibilities. And a lot of people getting mad at like shows like Steven Universe for having like a non-violent message instead of a message that they think they would have wanted to see, where it's like, you have forgotten you are not the target demographic for this. I know you wanted this giant take to task on like, hurt your oppressors, instead of getting mad at this idea that they said in the show, which is if you hurt your enemies, you're just as bad as them. I get that can be annoying to have someone like a grown adult say that to you, but you're not, this isn't for grown adults. This is for children. And I think too is the more people kind of cling to their like why, like I only read YA, and that's how you get so scandalized when you go into like the adult, media, and a lot of it does have things that are like protagonists that aren't good people. I see so like media literacy is at an all-time low because I see so many people like with a main character that isn't this like Boy Scout, and they fucking lose their minds. And I'm like, not every main character is going to be this like moral high ground. They do the right thing every time because people make mistakes, and that's cinema. Sometimes things are messy and sexy, and sometimes they say the fuck word, and sometimes like it gets bloody, and it's not always this fluffy feel good stuff. And I think instead of being like, why isn't more things sanitized to the point where I can watch it with my family, it's enough to be like, maybe not everything is for you. I think that's one of the like personal journeys that I've gone down, is like, not everything is for me, and just because something isn't for me doesn't mean that it needs to get the fuck out of Dodge. Like sometimes I'm just not the target demographic, and what you do then is you just move on because it's going to be for someone else.
Yeah. You write your letterboxed review and you move on.
And you get no bitches, and then you move on with no bitches. Being bitchless. That's as far as other articles that I got. I'm curious to see like any other final thoughts about sex scenes from you, as far as like, did I change your mind? Or like any other thing that you kind of, because I think the why is, I think, what is so interesting to me. And for that, there's kind of few answers. I think a lot of people, again, like theorize that maybe it's this and maybe it's this. But I think in general, this like, and I get that like sex is an adult thing and it's like being shown immediately, like, oh my God, they're having sex in front of my screen. But like, we don't necessarily have that reaction to a lot of other adult things. Like right now, oh God, I'll have to burp again. Christ. Like you could watch a horror movie right now where someone just gets like shot in the face and the bullet goes through one eye, out the other eye, and it's fucking gross. Do we just go like, ew, there's blood on my screen? Like, I know you do. I know you do.
I'm like, I'll say I could stand for a little less gore in certain things. But once again, like I'm definitely someone who I'm definitely someone who does not do well with gore, literally at all, which is why I avoid gore heavy horror films. Like that's not my media. That's not the media that I like to consume. I fully understand that other people enjoy that and really love like slashers and things like that. Not for me. Personally, not for me. And no, I definitely feel like you're right in that. I think because it makes us feel uncomfortable, so many people resent that feeling that they take it to an extreme where they're like, well, that just shouldn't be in media. That doesn't need to be in media. And it's like I said before, the same people who advocate for comprehensive like sex education are the people who are being like, no, I don't think like that sex scene was necessary. Like, I don't think that had to happen. Like, we didn't need to see anything. And it's like, I feel like sex is such a like amalgamation of like so many things that you can't just have like the scientific like do's and don'ts and like how to have safe sex and like all of these things, and then not also have representation of like how it can bond you emotionally and how it can, change this dynamic in this relationship.
How it can be fun.
Yeah, how it can be fun, how it can be bad, how it can be awkward. Like you can't, I think both of those serve value. And yeah, it's, I definitely think that it makes people uncomfortable and they just immediately are like, no, get it off my screen, which like, I understand, but I do think there definitely are scenes and scenarios in media where it is necessary and it does drive the plot in a certain way, or it tells you something about the character, or it tells you something about their relationship that's like really necessary. I think I wish I could like pull up a very specific example, but I feel like there are there's media where you might see someone in a relationship and you're like, oh my God, their relationship seems great, like blah, blah, blah. And then you cut to a sex scene and like their sex is like so awkward and uncomfortable and like non-pleasurable. So that way in the next scene, when you see that person like complaining about their partner or like contemplating breaking up or something, like it provides that context because like sometimes people are great and like the sexual chemistry just isn't there, and like that's also important in a relationship. But I think it's really interesting that we are kind of like regressing back to a place of like purity where it's like, no, get it off my screen, I don't want to see it.
It might give me a boner. Yeah. My mama's here.
But it's like, it's also, I think, so important because without these sex scenes in media, the only other sex scenes that we would have available to us is porn.
Yeah.
And I feel like we all kind of know like the negative effects of porn on the brain. And like that would not be okay if that was the only access that we had to like sexual media.
Yeah. And I think what a lot of, teens kind of bounce back from is they're like, no, I can't avoid it because it's everywhere. Like, you can avoid slasher movies because you don't want to see gore, but it'd be like if I surprised you with gore and a random circumstance. And I'm like, listen, bud. Like, not the same cannot be said for older movies because, again, like, I wasn't around and the regulations I feel like are different. But nowadays, if you want to include a sex scene, you have to work hard to include it, which means that they wouldn't have included it for no reason. You have to, and like, cast actors that are okay with it. You have to, like, get an intimacy coordinator to orchestrate the scene, to choreograph the scene. You have to, close set. You have to basically, and before it even gets to that stage, when you're writing the script, you have several scripties and like editors being like, are you sure this is necessary? If there is a sex scene in a modern thing, unless you're Sam Levinson, meet me outside. Usually, if it was unnecessary, it wouldn't have happened. Someone would have argued for it not to be there because a lot of, movies, I get that, like, also at the same time, movies are getting too long. And sometimes you're like, you can't cut this. But I feel like more and more people are like, things need to serve the story. We don't really have a lot of movies that are kind of free flow and casually kind of bounce around things. And this wasn't important, but we showed it anyway. This wasn't important, but we showed it anyway. Like, I feel like if a sex scene is included in a movie, they deemed it important enough that it communicated something either about the characters, about their dynamics, about about the power struggles that they might be having, about their own internalized fears, about their self. It communicated something. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be there. So even then it was like, people going back of like, I only want sex scenes if like they deserve to be there, if they earned it. It's like, what qualifies as earning it? You know what I mean? It's like, why do you get to be the judge of when a sex scene is deemed necessary or not if you've already decided that sex in general isn't necessary? Why should I give you that power if you've already decided that all of it's gross?
Wow. Big brain. Big brain.
Anyway, that's it for me. Yet again, it's sweaty in this apartment. I wish it weren't. Hold on, I'm going to do one last fan.
Yeah. Peep the pit stains. That feels so good. And now we will make orgasm noises into the microphone.
Make sure to turn this all the way up. This is not safe for work.
No, just kidding. Obviously.
That's not necessary to the plot of this podcast.
No, exactly. Sam Levinson. Not around these parts.
Put on my brass knuckles for you.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube if you want to see our faces and our pit stains.
My glowy complexion. Is it sweat or highlight? It's always sweat.
Who's to say? Yeah, thank you. Bye.